A spring rain fell softly on the cobblestones of Portsmouth, blurring the glow of gas lamps and pooling in the cracks where weary boots had passed. The port town, once a place of fishermen and quiet streets, thrummed now with a sense of purpose, every corner vibrating with the secrets of war. Trucks rumbled past rows of brick houses shrouded in blackout curtains, while the distant growl of aircraft overhead hinted at something immense and imminent unfolding just beyond the horizon. Lieutenant Daniel Harper had arrived only days before, his American uniform still stiff with unfamiliarity, his eyes bright with that peculiar mix of hope and dread that comes from being so close to history's edge. The dock seemed to him a living thing, cranes swinging, ships groaning, men in oilskins shouting orders above the wind. He'd grown up in Ohio, where the air was heavy with cornfields and the skies stretched unbroken for miles. Portsmouth felt like another world entirely, the salty tang of the sea and the constant pulse of activity, a reminder that the war he'd read about in newspapers was now unmistakably his own. He walked with purpose, but not quite at ease, boots clicking on wet stone as he made his way from his billet to headquarters. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and rain, and Daniel paused for a moment outside a tea shop, watching as a young woman emerged. Her hair tucked neatly beneath her nurse's cap, her hands occupied by a rationed loaf of bread and a battered umbrella. She glanced up, eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second, and in that moment the world seemed to contract just briefly before she disappeared into the mist. That image lingered with him as he fell in with his unit, a group as varied as the patchwork of nations now gathered on English soil. Some were seasoned veterans, their faces etched with lines of worry and pride. Others, like Daniel, wore their inexperience like a suit that didn't quite fit. The days were a blur of briefings, drills, and endless speculation about the coming invasion. The men traded rumors like cigarettes, France, Belgium, maybe even Norway, and tried to mask their fear with laughter. Nights brought little rest. Daniel found himself lying awake in the darkness, listening to the distant wail of sirens and the low hum of conversations from neighboring rooms. Letters from home arrived sporadically, each precious sheet of paper a lifeline to a world untouched by ration books and blackout shades. He wrote to his mother, promising he was safe and well, omitting the gnawing anxiety that grew with each passing day. One afternoon, during a training exercise along the rain-slicked cliffs outside town, Daniel's world shifted abruptly. A misstep on the muddy incline sent him tumbling, the crack of bone followed by a rush of pain and the blur of voices shouting his name. He drifted in and out of consciousness as he was bundled onto a stretcher, the grey English sky spinning above him. When he next opened his eyes, he was in a different world altogether. The hospital was an old schoolhouse repurposed for war, its chalkboards now covered with lists of patient names and urgent instructions. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and wet wool. Daniel's head throbbed, and his vision wavered as a gentle hand pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "Easy now," a voice murmured, calm and distinctly British. He blinked, focusing on the face above him. Evelyn Clarke. She was younger than he'd first thought, though her eyes held an exhaustion that seemed older than either of them had a right to be. Her hair, chestnut brown and hastily pinned, escaped in wisps around her temples. A faint smudge of ink stained her wrist, a remnant of hurried notes jotted between patients. "You took quite a fall," she said, offering a half-smile. "You Yanks do like to make an entrance." Daniel tried to laugh, but it came out as a groan. "Just wanted to see how the English mud measures up to Ohio's," he managed. "So in that case, I'll be sure to tell the local council you approve," she replied, eyes flickering with a spark of dry humor. Their exchange was brief. There were others needing more urgent care. But in the quiet that followed, Daniel found himself thinking not of the pain in his leg, but of the nurse with the steady hands and tired eyes. The days blurred together. Outside, the world braced for something vast and terrible, but inside the hospital, time was measured by the rhythm of footsteps in the corridors and the soft rustle of letters slipping beneath doors. Daniel's injury was, thankfully, minor, a fractured ankle and some bruised ribs, but the enforced rest gave him time to observe, to listen, and to notice. He watched Evelyn move through the ward with practiced efficiency, her white apron crisp against the drab walls, her voice gentle but firm, as she coaxed laughter from wounded men and argued with doctors twice her age. She was always in motion, yet there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when her shoulders sagged and her gaze turned inward, as though she carried the weight of every bandaged limb and every whispered goodbye. One evening, as rain lashed the windows and the ward settled into uneasy quiet, Daniel found Evelyn alone, rolling bandages by the glow of a single lamp. He approached, limping slightly, and offered a tentative smile. "Need a hand?" he asked, aware of how out of place he must seem. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. "If you're sure you won't undo all my hard work by fainting on me." He chuckled, easing himself onto the edge of a nearby cot. Together they worked in silence, hands moving in rhythm, the only sound the distant drip of water from the eaves. After a while, Daniel spoke. "You've been here since the Blitz, haven't you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Since the first bombs fell on Portsmouth. My father was a dock worker. He volunteered for the fire service." Her voice softened. "We lost our house in 41. After that, there wasn't much left but the work." There was a vulnerability in her words, raw and unguarded. Daniel found himself wanting to reach for her hand, to offer some comfort, but he held back, sensing that what she needed was not reassurance, but understanding. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She shrugged, a gesture that said she'd heard those words 100 times before. "We all lose something in war, Lieutenant. Sometimes it's a home. Sometimes it's more." A silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the rain eased, and the faint sound of a harmonica drifted from another ward, a reminder that even in the midst of suffering, there were moments of beauty. Over the following days, their paths crossed often. Sometimes it was little more than a shared smile as Daniel hobbled past on crutches, or a brief conversation over tea, rationed, weak, but precious all the same. Other times, it was the comfort of knowing that someone else understood the strange, suspended life of waiting for news, for letters, for the next great upheaval. Portsmouth itself seemed to hold its breath. The town was a mosaic of uniforms, Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, each man and woman a piece of a puzzle whose final shape no one could yet see. The shops were half empty, shelves stripped bare by rationing and the steady flow of troops. Children played in the ruins of bombed houses, their laughter echoing in streets where air raid sirens still sounded at night. Daniel began to look forward to Evelyn's presence with a longing that surprised him. In her, he saw not just the resilience of a nation under siege, but a glimpse of something gentler, a quiet hopefulness that refused to be extinguished by loss. One afternoon, as the hospital dozed in rare sunlight, Daniel found himself at the window, watching the harbour. Ships crowded the water, their decks bristling with equipment, while rows of landing craft bobbed like impatient horses at the starting gate. The enormity of what was coming pressed in on him, a weight he could neither name nor escape. Evelyn approached, her footsteps soft. "You're thinking about the invasion," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of simple fact. He nodded, unable to find the words. She stood beside him, gazing out at the same uncertain future. "My brother was at Dunkirk," she said quietly. "He wrote me letters every week, funny, silly things, as if he could keep the war at bay by pretending it was all a great adventure." She paused, her breath catching. He didn't come back. Daniel turned to her, searching for something to say, but she shook her head, a sad smile playing at her lips. "Sometimes I think the letters kept us both alive, at least for a little while." He understood then, in a way he hadn't before, the power of words, how a few lines could span oceans and bridge the chasms of fear and loss. That night, he began to write to her. The first letter was awkward, stilted, as though he were speaking a language he hadn't quite mastered. He wrote of home, of Ohio in the spring, of the way the light fell across the fields at dusk, of his mother's garden and his father's laughter. He wrote of the hospital, of the men in his unit, and of his own clumsy attempts to fit into a world that seemed both foreign and familiar. And hesitantly he wrote of her, the nurse with the ink-stained wrist and the laugh that lingered long after she'd gone. He slipped the letter into her hand one morning, his heart pounding in his chest, and watched as she tucked it into her apron without a word. The next day he found a reply on his bedside table, a single page, neatly folded, her handwriting looping and graceful. She wrote of Portsmouth, of the secret corners she loved, the old churchyard where wildflowers grew, the bakery that still managed to conjure a loaf of bread from almost nothing. She wrote of her dreams, of a world where the war was over and she could walk the streets without fear. Their correspondence became a quiet lifeline. In the letters they were braver, more honest than they could be face to face. They wrote of childhood memories and imagined futures, of fears they dared not speak aloud. The act of writing, of reaching across the gulf of uncertainty, became an act of hope. As Daniel's injury healed, his orders came. The invasion was near. His unit would be among the first to cross the channel. The news settled over him like a shroud, heavy with all the things left unsaid. On his last night in the hospital, the air thick with anticipation, Daniel found Evelyn in the empty corridor, her face illuminated by the glow of a single lamp. "I wish," he began, but the words faltered. She took his hand, her fingers cool and steady. "Come back," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Promise me you'll come back." He wanted to. Oh, how he wanted to promise her the world. But all he could offer was the truth. "I'll try," he said, and in that moment, surrounded by the hush of sleeping men and the distant thunder of guns, it was enough. Morning broke grey and cold. Daniel joined his unit, the weight of his pack matched only by the weight of what he carried in his heart. Evelyn watched from the steps of the hospital, her hand rising in a silent farewell. As the trucks pulled away, Daniel pressed her most recent letter to his chest, the words a small defiant spark against the darkness ahead. The invasion loomed, vast and unknowable, but somewhere beyond the horizon, hope endured. The days that followed passed in a blur of tension and restless anticipation, time stretching and contracting in unnatural ways as the world held its breath. Daniel's unit was quartered in a sprawling encampment on the outskirts of Portsmouth, the hedgerows and fields now transformed by the machinery of war, rows of canvas tents, endless columns of trucks, stacks of ammunition boxes and crates of rations. Soldiers moved with purpose through the mud, their faces set and silent, each man carrying his own private fears. The air smelled of diesel and damp earth, and above it all the low drone of aircraft was a constant, uneasy lullaby. Daniel felt the weight of command settle heavily on his shoulders. His men looked to him for reassurance, for answers he did not have. Some nights he lay awake, staring at the canvas above his head, recalling the softness of Evelyn's hand in his and the warmth of her voice. In the quiet moments he reread her letters, sometimes by the pale glow of a blackout lantern, sometimes by the first weak light of dawn. Her words became his tether to another life, a reminder that there was still something gentle and true in a world gone mad. He wrote back as often as he could, folding each page carefully, addressing the envelopes in his neatest hand. He told her about the camp, the endless drills, the way the English spring made everything smell fresh and new, even under the shadow of war. He tried to make her laugh, describing his attempts at British tea, always too strong or too weak, never quite right. In return, Evelyn's letters arrived tucked among the field orders and official communiques, their envelopes smudged with hospital ink and the faintest trace of her perfume. She wrote of the hospital's relentless pace, the shortages of bandages and morphine, the peculiar camaraderie of nurses and orderlies who had become her surrogate family. One evening, after a day spent slogging through rain and mud on maneuvers, Daniel sat on a wooden crate and read her latest letter. She described a patient who had insisted on singing "Roll Out the Barrel" at the top of his lungs, while she changed his dressings, and how the entire ward had joined in, laughter echoing down the corridors. "Sometimes," she wrote, "I think laughter is the bravest thing we can do." Her words warmed him in a way no fire could. The camp hummed with rumors and speculation, each day bringing new orders, new delays, new uncertainties. The men played cards, wrote letters of their own, and spoke in hushed voices of home. Daniel found himself watching the horizon, counting the days, then the hours, until they would be called to move. The knowledge of what lay ahead hung between him and his men, a chasm filled with unspoken hopes and fears. Meanwhile, in Portsmouth, Evelyn's world had narrowed to the dim corridors and crowded wards of the military hospital. The nights were the hardest, when the air raid sirens wailed and the blackout curtains fluttered in the draught, casting everything in shades of grey. She worked through exhaustion, her hands raw from scrubbing, her feet swollen and sore. The wounded arrived in waves, some silent with shock, others crying out for mothers and sweethearts. The nurses moved among them with quiet efficiency, offering what comfort they could. There was little time for tears. Yet even in the darkest hours, small joys persisted. A smuggled tin of condensed milk shared over tea. A letter from Daniel, read and reread until she could recite it by heart. The hesitant smile of a boy no older than her brother, grateful simply to be alive. These moments became her lifeline, her rebellion against despair. On the eve of the invasion, Daniel's unit was assembled in the pre-dawn chill, their faces pale in the uncertain light. Orders were barked, equipment checked and rechecked. Each man was issued a letter to be sent in the event of his death, a ritual that felt at once absurd and terrifyingly real. Daniel wrote his in the privacy of his tent, the words catching in his throat. He thought of Evelyn, of the promise he had made to try to come back. He folded the letter, sealed it, and slipped it into his breast pocket. They moved out before dawn, boarding the rumbling trucks that would carry them to the embarkation point. The port was a hive of activity, lines of soldiers snaking toward the water, the decks of ships crowded with men and supplies. Daniel felt strangely calm as he led his platoon aboard, the familiar weight of his pack settling against his spine. He found a place at the rail and watched the English coastline recede, the spires and rooftops fading into mist. Somewhere in the bustle of the city, Evelyn would be beginning her shift, perhaps pausing for a moment to think of him. The crossing was rough, the channel churned by wind and the passing wakes of 1,000 vessels. The men huddled below decks, some sleeping, some retching into buckets, each locked in his own thoughts. Daniel sat with his back against a bulkhead, turning Evelyn's letter over in his hands. He traced the curve of her handwriting, the words that had become his talisman. When at last the order came to land, it arrived not as a shout, but a hush, a collective intake of breath as the ramps dropped and the world exploded into chaos. Daniel led his men onto the beach, the sand churned by shellfire and the cries of the wounded. For hours, time lost all meaning. He moved through smoke and noise, the world reduced to the next step, the next breath. There was no room for fear, only the imperative to keep moving, to hold fast. Days blurred together. The fighting was fierce, the cost measured in lives and inches gained. Daniel lost friends, men he had trained with, laughed with, shared cigarettes and secrets with. He wrote their names in his notebook, promising himself he would remember. Through it all, Evelyn's letters remained his anchor. He tucked them inside his jacket, close to his heart, reading them during rare lulls in the fighting. Back in Portsmouth, Evelyn clung to the hope that Daniel was safe. She scanned the casualty lists as they arrived, her heart pounding each time she saw a familiar regiment or unit. The hospital overflowed with the wounded from Normandy, each man a reminder of the risks Daniel faced. She worked double shifts, her body running on adrenaline and willpower, her mind drifting to memories of their brief time together. His shy smile, the way he said her name, the feel of his hand in hers. She wrote to him every night, her words a lifeline thrown across the channel. She told him about the small victories, the patient who walked again, the nurse who sang lullabies to the dying, the unexpected kindness of strangers. She confessed her fears too, the nightmares that woke her in the darkness, the ache of missing him. She dared to write about the future, about the life they might build together if the war ever ended. Weeks passed. The news from the front was grim, heavy casualties, slow progress, towns reduced to rubble. Daniel's unit pressed inland, fighting for every hedgerow and farmhouse. The nights were cold, the days a blur of mud and exhaustion. Letters from home arrived sporadically, sometimes weeks late, but each one was a gift. Daniel read Evelyn's words by candlelight, her voice a balm against the horrors around him. Then one morning everything changed. A shell landed near Daniel's position, the world erupting in fire and noise. He was thrown to the ground, his leg torn by shrapnel. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a hot, blinding agony. He heard voices, someone calling his name, hands dragging him to safety. The next hours passed in a haze of morphine and confusion, the world reduced to pain and fleeting moments of clarity. He woke in a field hospital, the ceiling a blur above him. His leg was bandaged, his uniform gone. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. For days he drifted between consciousness and dreams, his mind filled with fevered images. Evelyn's face, the sound of her laughter, the promise he had made. He clung to her letter, the paper worn thin from handling. News of Daniel's injury reached the hospital in Portsmouth weeks later, a brief message buried in a stack of official notices. Evelyn's heart stopped when she saw his name, her hands trembling as she read the details. Wounded, stable, transferred to a hospital somewhere in France. Relief warred with terror. He was alive, but beyond her reach. That night, Evelyn made her decision. She could not remain in Portsmouth, tending to the endless flow of wounded, while Daniel lay somewhere across the water, injured and alone. She volunteered for transfer, citing her experience and her fluency in French. It was not an easy request. Nurses were desperately needed everywhere, but she pleaded her case, her determination unyielding. Within days she found herself on a transport ship, bound for the continent, the coastline of England receding behind her. The journey was perilous, the threat of U-boats, the uncertainty of where she would be sent, but Evelyn's resolve never wavered. She clung to the hope that fate, or perhaps something stronger, would guide her to Daniel. France was a landscape of devastation and confusion. The roads were choked with refugees and military convoys, villages reduced to rubble, fields scorched by shellfire. The hospitals overflowed with the wounded, their halls echoing with pain and exhaustion. Evelyn was assigned to a sprawling field hospital near Caen, her days consumed by triage, bandaging wounds, and offering comfort to the dying. She searched for news of Daniel in every spare moment, asking after him among the orderlies and doctors, scanning the lists of admissions and transfers. The answers came slowly, if at all. Records lost, names misspelled or missing. The front shifted constantly, lines of communication stretched thin. Still she persisted, driven by the memory of his promise, by the letters she carried in her uniform pocket. Daniel's recovery was slow. The wound in his leg was severe, infection a constant threat. Some nights he lay awake, haunted by memories of battle, the screams, the smoke, the faces of men he could not save. He thought often of Evelyn, of her hands guiding him back from the edge. He wondered if she had heard of his injury, if she would forgive him for being unable to keep his promise. In the rare quiet moments he wrote to her, his letters filled with longing and regret. He told her about the hospital, the nurses who reminded him of her, the endless monotony of recovery. He confessed his fears, the guilt he felt for surviving when so many had not. He dared to hope that she might find him, that somehow their paths would cross again. For both Daniel and Evelyn, the war had become a labyrinth of loss and longing, each day a test of endurance and hope. Yet through the chaos and despair, their love endured, a fragile thread woven through the fabric of war, stronger than the darkness that threatened to consume them both. The first light of dawn crept over the battered rooftops of Normandy, painting the rubble in soft gold and grey. Evelyn stood at the threshold of a makeshift field hospital, her uniform wrinkled and mud-stained, her hands trembling with exhaustion and anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, iodine and distant gunpowder, a lingering reminder that the fighting had not yet truly ceased. Behind her, a line of weary medics shuffled stretchers inside, their faces etched with fatigue and something like hope. The war had shifted, but its shadow remained. She clutched the faded satchel that had accompanied her from Portsmouth, fingers tracing the outline of Daniel's last letter. It was worn from countless readings, the ink smudged where her tears had fallen. Each word was a lifeline, humor in the midst of horror, gentle promises that carried her through sleepless nights. She had read it again on the Channel crossing, on the jolting ride through shattered French villages, and as she waited for her credentials to be approved by the overworked Allied bureaucrats. She had volunteered for the transfer under the pretense of needing experienced nurses at the front, but everyone knew, her supervisor, her colleagues, perhaps even the officers who stamped her papers, that she was searching for someone. The war had become a maze of missing men and lost names, but hope was a stubborn thing. Inside, the hospital was chaos and order intertwined. Cots crammed so closely together that there was barely space to walk. The air was heavy with the murmur of suffering, moans, whispered prayers, the clatter of medical instruments. Evelyn's practiced eye swept the room for familiar faces as she moved among the wounded, offering cool water, adjusting bandages, exchanging brief, quiet words. Each man she tended seemed for a heartbeat, like he might be Daniel. But none were. Days blurred. She gave herself over to the rhythm of work. Disinfect, reassess, soothe, record. In the rare moments between shifts, she haunted the intake tents, scanning manifests and casualty lists. The language barrier was a minor obstacle. She had learned enough French to get by, and her English accent opened doors among British and American officers alike. Still, the scale of suffering threatened to overwhelm her. Names miswritten, tags lost, entire units scattered or erased. She tried not to think of what that could mean for Daniel. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, she found herself sitting on a crate outside the tent, hands shaking as she unfolded Daniel's letter yet again. She read his words aloud in a whisper, as if saying them might conjure him from the ruins. "You promised me the first dance when this is over," she murmured, voice breaking. "You'd better keep your word, Lieutenant Harper." A nurse from the Canadian unit, a stout woman with kind eyes, sat beside her. "Someone you love?" she asked gently. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. The woman squeezed her hand. "The war takes too much, but sometimes it gives back. Don't lose hope." That night sleep would not come. The wind rattled the tent flaps, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. Evelyn stared at the canvas ceiling, replaying every moment with Daniel, his shy smile, the warmth of his hand, the way he listened as if her words mattered more than the world ending outside. She remembered the first time he had confided his fears to her, the night they'd watched the searchlight sweep the sky and talked of futures they dared not imagine. Was he thinking of her now, wherever he was? The next morning, she was summoned by the chief nurse, a brisk woman with a clipped American accent. "There's a new convoy in," she explained. "Some of the men are in bad shape. Americans, mostly. Infantry from the 29th and 1st Divisions. We need you on triage." Evelyn's pulse hammered. She forced herself to move with professional calm, but her mind raced with wild, impossible hope. In the triage tent, the noise was overwhelming. Groans, shouted orders, the metallic reek of blood. She moved from cot to cot, assessing wounds, offering comfort where she could, and then she saw him. At first she did not recognize him. The young man on the stretcher was thinner, paler than she remembered. His face was unshaven, eyes sunken with pain and fever. One arm was bandaged, the other clutching a dog tag. But as she knelt at his side, her breath caught. "Daniel." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he stared at her as if seeing a ghost. Then his mouth trembled into a smile, raw and astonished. "Evelyn." She pressed her hand to his cheek, her fingers trembling. "Oh, Daniel." He reached for her, his grip weak but desperate, as if afraid she might vanish. "You found me," he croaked. Tears slid down her cheeks. "I told you I would." For a long, fragile moment, the war receded. There was only the two of them, hands entwined, breaths mingling, hope rekindled in the wreckage. Around them, the hospital bustled on, but Evelyn heard nothing but Daniel's faltering voice, felt nothing but the thrum of his pulse beneath her palm. As the sun climbed higher, she moved to care for his wounds with gentle efficiency, checking his chart, asking quiet questions. He had been badly injured, shrapnel in his leg, a fractured rib, a fever that lingered. He spoke little of the battle, but she saw the shadows in his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden noises. He had lost men, friends with whom he had shared cigarettes and letters from home. Survivor's guilt gnawed at him, a silent wound deeper than any she could dress. "Sometimes I wish I hadn't made it," he admitted one night, voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the tent. "It's like I left a part of myself out there." She squeezed his hand. "You did what you had to do. You came back. That matters." He looked at her, searching her face for something he could not name. "Do I still seem like the man you met in Portsmouth?" She brushed the hair from his forehead, her touch lingering. "You're changed, Daniel. We both are. But I see you. I always will." The days that followed were a slow, uncertain healing. Daniel's body mended, though pain lingered and movement came with effort. Evelyn remained by his side when her duties allowed, reading him letters from home, bringing him contraband tea, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence. The war raged on beyond the tent walls, but in those stolen hours, they rebuilt something fragile and precious. They spoke of what had been lost: Evelyn's brother killed during the Blitz, Daniel's closest friend gone on the beaches of Normandy. Their grief was a third presence between them, sometimes pulling them apart, sometimes binding them closer. They spoke of the future in tentative phrases, afraid to hope too much. "Do you think it will ever end?" Daniel asked one afternoon, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Evelyn considered. "Everything ends, even this. And when it does, we'll find a way to begin again." He traced her fingers, memorizing the shape of her hand. "Promise me something. Anything. When all this is over, when the world is quiet again, meet me back in Portsmouth, by the pier near the old lighthouse. I want that first dance." She smiled, tears bright in her eyes. "It's a promise." As summer bled into autumn, the front lines shifted ever eastward. The hospital packed up, moving from one ruined town to the next. Daniel was transferred with the other recovering soldiers, his release delayed by recurring fever and nightmares that left him gasping in the dark. Evelyn's transfer orders came through at last, sending her back to England. Their farewell was quiet. No grand declarations, just a lingering embrace and the press of lips on a trembling hand. "Write to me," he whispered. "Every day," she promised. They parted with hope and fear tangled together, uncertain if fate would be kind. Months passed. The war ground on, but rumors of peace began to ripple through the camps, Germany weakening, the Allies advancing. Letters traveled slowly, sometimes lost in the shuffle, but each one that arrived was a treasure. Daniel wrote of his recovery, of afternoons spent limping along foreign roads, of dreams that woke him screaming. Evelyn wrote of the hospital in Portsmouth, of ration lines and blackouts, of a world holding its breath for the war's end. And then, at last, it came. V-Day. Crowds spilling into the streets, strangers embracing, church bells ringing out the promise of a future reclaimed. Evelyn stood on the pier at Portsmouth, her heart pounding with hope and terror. The lighthouse beacon swept the harbour as it always had. She clutched Daniel's last letter, the words smudged but indelible. "I'll find you." He appeared at sunset, limping but grinning, his uniform patched and faded. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the vastness of all they had survived stretching between them. "You kept your promise," he said, voice shaking. She ran to him, laughter and tears mingling. He caught her in his arms, and for the first time in years the world felt whole. They danced beneath the lighthouse, the distant music of celebration drifting on the breeze. Around them, the city pulsed with new life, flags flying, children laughing, lovers reunited. But for Daniel and Evelyn, there was only the quiet rhythm of their hearts, the memory of all they had lost and the fragile, beautiful hope of what might come. They spoke of the future in earnest now, of quiet evenings, of gardens and laughter, of the family they might build from the ruins. They did not pretend the scars would vanish or that the world would ever be as it was before. But in each other, they found the courage to believe in something brighter. As the stars shimmered above the harbour, Daniel pressed his forehead to hers. "We survived," he whispered. She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes. And now we live." The war had changed everything, had taken and broken, had shaped them in ways they could not yet understand. But love, stubborn and defiant, had endured. In the end, it was not the uniform or the nurse's cap that defined them, but the simple, enduring truth, that even in the darkest hour, hope was possible, and love could find its way home.